dozens of them rising through the blizzard like trembling stars refusing to die. They swayed in the hands of men and women who had no business climbing a frozen hillside. At midnight, people in heavy coats and wool hats, their boots slipping on ice, their breath torn away by the wind before it could form a cloud. But still they climbed. Still they held their lights high against the howling dark. Somewhere above them, lost in the white fury of the storm, a man ran. He carried 2 small lives against his chest, wrapped inside his coat, pressed so tightly to his ribs that he could feel their heartbeats tangling with his own. The puppies had stopped whimpering 10 minutes ago. He did not know if that was a good sign or a terrible one. He only knew that stopping was not something his body would allow. Behind him, headlights slashed through the trees. Engines roared. Men shouted orders that the wind swallowed whole. They were close, closer than they had been 5 minutes ago. And the ridge above him was steep, slick, unforgiving. Beckett Hale had survived firefights in countries whose names were classified. He had crawled through burning wreckage with a dislocated shoulder and a teammate on his back. He had spent 11 years as a Navy SEAL, learning that the human body could endure far more than the human mind believed possible. But tonight, running through a blizzard with 2 6-week-old German Shepherd puppies tucked against his heart, he was more afraid than he had ever been on any battlefield. Because on the battlefield, the thing he was protecting was himself. And he had stopped caring about that a long time ago. The voice cracked through the storm like a gunshot. Beckett, an old woman's voice, frail but fierce, rising from somewhere below the ridge where the lanterns gathered. He knew that voice. It belonged to someone who had lost too much. Already, someone who had no reason to stand in a blizzard at her age, and yet there she was, calling his name into the teeth of winter, as if her voice alone could hold back the darkness. "Run, Beckett! Get them out of there!" He ran, and somewhere inside his coat, pressed against the place where his heart had been frozen for longer than he could remember, a tiny body stirred. A small warm tongue licked his collarbone. And Beckett Hale, who had not cried since he was 19 years old, felt something hot and unfamiliar burn behind his eyes. But that was later. That was the end of something and the beginning of everything. This is how it started. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments below. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if this one touches your heart the way it touched mine, I hope you will stay until the very end. Because what happened to these 2 little puppies and the broken man who found them is something I believe you were meant to hear today. 5 days earlier, the morning light over northern Idaho was not really light at all. It was a pale, reluctant smear behind clouds so thick they seemed to press the sky downward, flattening the world into shades of white and gray. Snow fell in curtains across the long county road that cut through endless pine forest. Each tree bowed under the weight of frost, each gust of wind carrying the sharp, clean sting of ice. The world looked suspended, as if sound itself had frozen, and only the low, steady hum of a truck engine dared to break the silence. Beckett Hale kept both hands on the steering wheel, though he was not entirely present behind it. At 38, he was built the way storms build mountains. Slowly, violently, and with evidence of every impact left behind. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his frame carved by over a decade of training and missions that had taken more from him than they had given. His dark hair was cut close, flecked with premature gray near the temples that made him look older than his years. His jaw was strong, roughened by several days of stubble he had not bothered to shave. And his eyes, which might have been a warm, gentle blue once upon a time, had faded into something quieter, guarded, tired, like windows in a house where no one lived anymore. He had the expression of a man who had forgotten how to belong anywhere except a battlefield. And now that the battlefield was gone, he had nothing left to stand on. His unit had been dissolved 4 months ago. Most of his team had scattered. Some retired to quiet lives they would spend years pretending to enjoy. Some transferred to other divisions chasing the next mission because sitting still felt like drowning. And the one whose face Beckett still saw every time he closed his eyes, had not made it out of a collapsing building in a city whose name he was not permitted to speak aloud. The counselor at the Veterans Center had suggested he take leave, reconnect with something, go somewhere familiar, find home Beckett. She had said with the kind of gentle certainty that only people who had never lost everything could afford. Home. He had turned the word over in his mind like a stone pulled from a riverbed, examining it from every angle, and found nothing underneath. No memory attached to it. No warmth. Home was a concept that belonged to other people who had not spent their 20s and 30s sleeping in forward operating bases and learning to read the distance of a gunshot by the echo off concrete walls. Northern Idaho was not home. It was simply a place where the road was empty enough to think. And maybe he had started to realize that was the problem. Thinking hurt worse than anything a bullet had ever done. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the cold air inside the cab. The heater rattled, but produced only a thin stream of warmth that barely reached his knees. His knuckles tightened around the steering wheel as another memory rose uninvited. Fire! A collapsing door frame. A hand reaching through smoke. Beck, I can't see, I can't... He blinked. Hard. Not now, not here. Just keep driving, he muttered to the empty cab. His voice sounded foreign to him. Rough. Unused. Like a door that had not been opened in months. The truck's tires crunched along the icy asphalt as the forest narrowed around him, the pines pressing closer on both sides until the road felt like a tunnel carved through white silence. Snow collected on the windshield faster than the wipers could push it away, each swipe leaving a brief, blurry window into the world before the white rushed back. He thought about pulling over, waiting out the worst of it. But pulling over meant sitting still, and sitting still meant the memories would find him. So he drove on, mile after mile, through a landscape that looked like the inside of an empty church. Then, as he rounded a gentle bend where the road dipped slightly before climbing again, something flickered at the edge of his vision. Something small. Something that should not have been there. Beckett jerked upright in his seat, every nerve firing at once. 2 shapes stood in the middle of the road. He braked hard. The truck skidded forward on the ice snow, spraying in a soft explosion from beneath the tires, and lurched to a stop 20 feet from whatever stood in his path. His heartbeat slammed once against his ribs, then went still the way it always did when danger appeared. Not faster. Quieter. The body's way of making room for focus. At first he thought they were shadows. Maybe branches blown onto the road by the storm. Maybe a trick of the flat winter light playing against the snow. But then one of them moved. And then the other. 2 tiny puppies stood on the snow-packed asphalt, trembling so violently that their small bodies seemed to vibrate. German shepherds by the look of their coloring. Black and tan with ears too large for their heads and paws too big for their legs. They were barely 6 or 7 weeks old, still soft with the roundness of infancy, still unsteady on legs that had not yet learned how to carry them properly. Their fur was stiff with frost. Tiny needles of ice clung to their ears, their muzzles, the thin fur along their bellies. The smaller one shivered so hard that its entire body rocked side to side like a flame about to go out. But it was not their size that stopped Beckett's breath. It was what they were doing. They were standing on their hind legs, barely balanced, wobbling their small front paws lifted toward him in a gesture that looked so unmistakably like a plea that his chest locked tight around something he could not name. Their amber eyes, wide and glassy with cold, caught the gray light and held it. And in those eyes, he saw something he recognized. Desperation. The kind that has already given up on everything except one last chance. He knew that look. He had seen it in the mirror. Beckett swallowed. His first instinct was disbelief. Animals did not do that. Not naturally. Not unless they had been taught or unless something deeper than instinct was driving them. But the longer he stared through the windshield at those two tiny creatures lifting their paws toward him in the falling snow, the more undeniable it became. They were begging. The taller one let out a cry. It was thin, raspy, barely audible above the wind. The sound of a creature so cold and so weak that it had nearly forgotten how to make noise at all. The smaller one pressed close to its sibling, its body shaking so violently that its ears flickered with each tremor. Something shifted inside Beckett's chest. A crack. Small but unmistakable, running through a wall he had spent years building, a wall made of silence and discipline, and the quiet agreement he had made with himself that feeling things was a luxury he could no longer afford. He opened the truck door. The cold hit him instantly, biting the exposed skin on his face, his neck, his ears. The wind pushed against him as if trying to shove him back inside, but the puppies did not retreat. If anything, they stumbled toward him, their tiny paws half numb, their steps clumsy and urgent and full of a hope so raw it hurt to witness. Beckett crouched, slowly lowering himself to their level. Up close, they were even smaller than he had thought, fragile in a way that made his throat tighten. The taller one had a faint scrape along its front leg, scabbed over but still tender. The smaller one had snow crusted around its nose, and its breathing was shallow, uneven, the kind of breathing that meant the cold was winning. He had seen wounded soldiers, starving civilians, animals trapped in collapsed buildings. But these two carried none of the defensive wildness he was used to encountering. There was no snarl, no flinch, no desperate snap of teeth. Their eyes held a different kind of fear, the kind that comes from being abandoned, not attacked. "Where did you two come from?" he whispered. They did not answer, of course, but their gaze locked onto his face and did not waver. Steady, pleading, as if they understood that this man, this stranger, climbing out of a truck in the middle of a blizzard, was the only thing standing between them and the end. Beckett looked away. He looked at the empty road stretching in both directions, at the unbroken snow on either side, at the forest that stood silent and indifferent to everything. He knew better than to get involved. He was here to decompress, to disappear. He was not here to rescue anything. He could not even rescue himself. Then the smaller puppy lost its balance. Its hind legs gave out, and it toppled sideways into the snow. It lay there, trembling, its small chest heaving with breaths that were growing further apart. It did not get up. The crack inside Beckett widened. He knelt and scooped the puppy into his hands. It weighed almost nothing. Its body curled instinctively into his palms, seeking warmth with a desperation that went beyond instinct into something closer to prayer. He felt its heartbeat against his fingers. Fast, frantic, but alive. Barely, impossibly, stubbornly alive. The other puppy pawed weakly at his boot, lifting its small face toward him with an expression that needed no translation. Please. Beckett lifted that one, too. He tucked both of them inside his coat, pressing them against his chest where his own heartbeat could reach them. Their tiny bodies shook against his ribs, but slowly, degree by degree, their trembling eased as they absorbed his warmth. One of them nuzzled into the hollow of his throat. The other gripped the fabric of his shirt with its small frozen paws and held on as if it would never let go. He stood in the middle of that empty road, snow falling all around him, 2 dying puppies pressed against his heart, and felt something he had not felt in years. He felt needed. He stared down the road in both directions. No paw prints, no tire marks besides his own, no sign of a mother dog, no nearby houses, no indication that anyone had driven this way in hours. Whoever had left these puppies here had done it deliberately, had carried them to this road, set them down in the snow, and driven away, knowing that the cold would finish what cruelty had started. His jaw tightened until his teeth ached. Monsters came in many forms. Some wore uniforms. Some carried weapons. And some simply drove away from 2 small lives and never looked back. He walked back to the truck and opened the passenger door. The snow swirled around him, stinging his face, but for the first time in months, he did not feel numb. Something was happening inside him. Something small and fragile and terrifying, like a seed breaking through frozen ground. He eased the puppies onto the passenger seat and pulled his old military blanket around them. They blinked up at him with those amber eyes, still shaking, still afraid, but no longer alone. "All right," he murmured. His voice came out softer than he expected, softer than he knew it could still be. "You are coming with me." The puppies pressed together beneath the blanket, their small tails twitching with the faintest, most fragile spark of hope. They watched him with a trust so complete, so unearned, that it felt like a wound opening in the best possible way. He shut the door gently, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road. The town of Willow Bend appeared through the snow like a memory half forgotten. A handful of intersecting streets, lined with wooden storefronts and faded signs, all of it muted under the white blanket of winter. Beckett parked in front of a narrow brick building with a hand-painted sign that read, Callaway Veterinary Clinic, since 1978. He lifted the puppies into his arms, blanket and all, and stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly. The lobby smelled of antiseptic and cedarwood, clean and warm. Behind the counter stood a woman with silver hair pinned in a gentle bun and wire-framed glasses resting low on her nose. She was small, perhaps, 5'3", but she held herself with the quiet authority of someone who had weathered enough storms to stop fearing them. This was Edith Callaway, 70 years old, the only veterinarian Willow Bend had known for nearly half a century. She looked up and her hazel eyes went straight to the bundle in his arms. "My goodness," she murmured, stepping forward. "What do we have here?" "Found them on the road," Beckett said. "Freezing. I do not know how long they were out there." Edith did not reach for the puppies immediately. Instead, she touched the blanket covering them, her fingers gentle feeling their trembling through the fabric. Her expression shifted. Not shock, something deeper. The quiet sorrow of a woman who had seen this kind of cruelty before and had never made peace with it. "Bring them to the exam room," she said. "We will take a proper look." The room was warm, lit by a soft lamp instead of the harsh overhead fluorescence. Edith unwrapped the blanket carefully. The puppies whimpered at the cold air pressing into each other. She hummed a low, soothing melody as she examined them, her hands incredibly steady for a woman her age. German shepherds, she murmured. 6, maybe 7 weeks, severely underweight. She lifted one of the pups gently and paused. Her fingers traced a faint line around its midsection. "See this," she said quietly. "Marks from something tight, a rope or strap. They were confined, held in a space far too small for them." She set the puppy down with infinite care and looked at Beckett. Her hazel eyes searched his face for a long moment. "You care," she said, "not a question, an observation. I just could not leave them there." "Of course you could not." She tilted her head, studying him the way she might study an animal brought in from the cold. With patience, with recognition. "You have that look. The look of someone trying to outrun something that lives inside them." His breath caught. "I do not—" "You do not have to explain," she said gently. She rested a soft hand on his forearm. "I recognize it. My husband wore that same expression for 30 years. She paused, and something tender and old passed across her face. He was a soldier, too. Served overseas for a long time. Came back gentle on the outside, but carrying storms no one could see. And do you know what he did? He saved every stray creature he found. Every bird with a broken wing. Every dog left on the side of the road. As if healing them helped mend parts of himself that nothing else could reach." Beckett lowered his gaze. No one had spoken to him like this in years. Without judgment. Without the careful distance people kept around men they suspected were damaged. Edith continued treating the puppies. She checked their temperature, fed them warm formula from a small bottle, massaged their stiff, frozen paws between her palms. Her movements were practiced unhurried, filled with the kind of love that does not announce itself, but simply shows up again and again in the quiet work of caring. When the smaller puppy finished drinking, it crawled on unsteady legs into Beckett's lap. The other followed, curling into the crook of his arm, as if it had always belonged there. Edith smiled. "They have chosen you. I am not exactly in a place to take care of anything right now." She tilted her head. "Sometimes, young man, the very moment you believe you cannot care for something is exactly when you are meant to. Life rarely asks permission before sending purpose your way." The words settled over him like the blanket he had wrapped around the puppies. Warm, unexpected, almost unbearable. He looked down at the 2 small creatures in his arms. They gazed back at him with eyes that held no accusation, no demand, no memory of whatever horror had come before. Only trust. Only the simple, devastating belief that this man, this stranger, would not let them down. He did not know if he deserved that, but he knew with a certainty that surprised him that he would not betray it. "Take them home," Edith said softly. "Keep them warm. Stay with them tonight. They will feel safer." Beckett stood slowly, the weight of the puppies oddly grounding like an anchor, pulling him into the present moment in a way nothing else had managed in months. As he walked toward the door, Edith's voice followed him, quiet but clear. "When animals look at you with trust, do not ignore it. They only give it when they see something good." He paused. He did not know how to answer. So he simply nodded and walked out into the falling snow. At the truck, he settled the puppies onto the passenger seat one more time. They blinked up at him. And this time, there was no terror in their eyes. Only warmth. Only hope. A quiet whisper slipped from him before he realized he had spoken. "I think I will call you Copper." He touched the taller one's ear where the fur caught the light in warm bronze tones. Then he looked at the smaller one, the brave, trembling one who had fallen in the snow and refused to stop breathing. "And you little guy, you are Scout." The puppies wagged their tiny tails, and just like that, Winter felt a little less cold. But as Beckett pulled away from the clinic and turned toward Pine Ridge Road, he did not notice the black pickup truck parked 2 blocks down the street. Its engine was off. Its windows were dark, and inside it, someone was watching. The cabin on Pine Ridge sat at the edge of Willow Bend like something the forest had grown around and forgotten. It was small, built from logs that had darkened with age, its roof patched in places where winter had tested the seams. A narrow porch faced the tree line, and a rusted iron chimney rose from the back wall, leaning just slightly to the left, as if it too had grown tired of standing straight. It was not a home, not really. It was a place to sleep where no one would find him. And for the past 3 days before the puppies that had been enough. But tonight the cabin felt different. Beckett had built the fire in the old iron stove until it roared. The flames threw warm, shifting light across the wooden walls, turning the shadows into something almost alive. He had spread his military blanket across the worn leather couch and set the 2 puppies on top of it, arranging them carefully, the way he had once arranged supplies in a field pack. Methodical, precise, as if the act of being useful could keep everything else from rushing in. Copper, the larger of the 2, had recovered faster. He lay on his back with his oversized paws in the air, his belly exposed in a posture of absolute surrender. It was Beckett knew the ultimate sign of trust in a dog. A dog that showed its belly was saying, "I believe you will not hurt me." Coming from a creature that had been bound and abandoned in the snow, the gesture hit harder than it should have. Scout was different. Smaller, quieter, more watchful. He tucked himself under Copper's belly, like a shadow seeking shelter beneath a larger shadow. His dark eyes tracked Beckett's every movement with an intensity that was almost human. When Beckett moved to the kitchen, Scout's gaze followed. When Beckett sat down, Scout relaxed. When the wind rattled the window, Scout pressed closer to his brother and waited to see what Beckett would do before deciding whether to be afraid. He was, Beckett realized, reading the room. The way a soldier reads a room when he enters a building for the first time. Checking exits, measuring threats, deciding who to trust. Beckett warmed the puppy formula Edith had given him, testing the temperature against his wrist, the way he had seen mothers do in airports and coffee shops during the years he spent passing through places that were never his. He held the bottle for Copper first, who drank greedily, his small tail swishing across the blanket. Then Scout, who approached the bottle with caution, sniffed it twice, looked up at Beckett as if asking permission, and only then began to drink. Something in Beckett's chest loosened. Not much, just a fraction. Like a bolt that had been torqued too tight for too long, finally giving a quarter turn. He sat on the floor with his back against the couch. Copper rolled off the cushion and landed in his lap with a soft thud, immediately nuzzling into the crook of his arm. Scout followed more carefully, climbing down with the deliberate focus of a mountaineer and settled against Beckett's thigh. His small body pressed close, and after a moment, he let out a sigh so deep and so complete that it sounded like it had been held inside him since the day he was born. Beckett looked down at them, 2 small lives breathing against him, trusting him, choosing him for reasons he could not understand. He smiled. It happened before he could stop it. A small, involuntary movement of his mouth, barely visible, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. But it was real. The first genuine smile in months, and it startled him more than any explosion ever had. The fire crackled, the wind hummed against the windows, the puppies slept. And for one brief miraculous hour, Beckett Hale felt something close to peace. Then morning came. He woke at dawn the way he always did, his body pulling him from sleep with the mechanical precision of a decade of military conditioning. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was cool, but not cold. Copper and Scout were still asleep on the blanket, curled into a single ball of warmth, their breathing synchronized. Beckett pulled on his boots and his heavy coat and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wall. The sky was pale, the clouds low and flat, the kind of winter morning that felt colder than night itself. His breath came in thick, white plumes that the wind shredded instantly. The snow around the cabin stretched in every direction, smooth and untouched and blindingly white, until he looked down. His mug of coffee, which he had been raising to his lips, stopped halfway. Footprints. Human footprints pressed deep into the snow circled the cabin in a path so deliberate it could not have been accidental. They approached from the tree line on the east side, curved along the back wall, paused beneath the rear window where the puppies had been sleeping, then continued around to the front porch, and stopped at the pile of split firewood stacked against the siding. Beckett crouched beside them, his fingers hovering over the imprints. The edges were sharp, clean, not yet softened by wind or fresh snowfall. These prints had been made recently, hours ago at most, while he slept. While Copper and Scout slept helpless and warm and trusting on the other side of a wall that suddenly felt far too thin, every muscle in his body tightened. The instinct was instant automatic, the same neural circuitry that had kept him alive in buildings rigged with explosives and alleyways where shadows carried weapons. His eyes swept the tree line. His ears filtered the wind for any sound that did not belong. His breathing slowed to a controlled rhythm that his body knew meant one thing. Threat detected. He followed the prints to the firewood pile and stopped. There, half buried in the snow beside the bottom log, lay a torn scrap of cardboard. He picked it up and brushed the frost from its surface. Red printed stripe, frayed twine still attached to one edge. The same material, the same kind of binding that had left marks around the puppies' bodies. Someone had come here in the night. Someone who knew where the puppies were. Someone who had stood outside the window where they slept close enough to hear them breathe and then walked away. Not because they had given up, because they were deciding what to do next. Beckett's jaw clenched so hard he felt it in his temples. He pocketed the cardboard and went back inside, locking the door behind him with a force that made Copper lift his head in sleepy confusion. Scout was already awake, already watching. His dark eyes tracked Beckett across the room with that same careful intensity, as if he could read the change in the man's posture, the new tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had curled into fists without his permission. "It is all right," Beckett whispered, but his voice was the voice of a man who did not believe his own words. By noon of the second day, Beckett needed supplies. Proper puppy food, more formula blankets, disinfectant for the scrape on Copper's leg. He loaded the puppies into the truck, tucked them under his jacket on the passenger seat, and drove toward Willow Bend. The town looked even smaller in daylight. A few intersecting streets, a post office, a gas station with a single pump, and a handful of storefronts that had survived decades through stubbornness alone. Snow lay thick on every rooftop, and icicles hung from gutters like glass teeth. He parked in front of a building with an aging green sign that read, "Gentry's Market, since 1969. The paint was chipped, the lettering faded, but the door opened with a warm chime, and the air inside smelled of cinnamon and something baked. Behind the counter stood Helen Gentry. She was 68 years old, tall and slightly stooped from years of work, with silver hair that spiraled down her shoulders in loose, frizzy waves. She wore a knitted forest green sweater and round glasses perched low on her nose. Her face was deeply lined, but the gray-blue of her eyes held a warmth that the lines could not diminish. She looked up as Beckett entered. "New face," she said. Her voice was steady, observant, carrying the firmness of someone who had learned long ago that kindness and caution were not opposites. "Have not seen you around town." "Just passing through," Beckett said. "Staying near the ridge for a bit." Helen studied him, his posture, the controlled way he moved, the way his eyes swept the room once before, settling on her, a habit he did not even notice anymore. "You look like someone who has been through a lot of bits," she murmured. He picked up cans of puppy formula fleece blankets, a small bag of kibble, and disinfectant. Helen raised an eyebrow as she scanned the items. "Not the kind of supplies most travelers pick up. Found a couple of strays," he said, trying to help them out. Something shifted in Helen's face. Her lips softened, but her eyes went dark with a worry that ran deeper than the conversation. "Strays," she repeated. "On the road near the ridge. Young, 6 or 7 weeks." Helen set the blanket down very slowly. Her hands, which had been efficient and quick a moment ago, became deliberate, careful, as if sudden movement might disturb something fragile in the air. "Be careful with that," she whispered. "This town has not been safe for animals lately." The words landed heavier than they should have. Beckett waited. Helen exhaled. Her shoulders lowered, and she leaned against the counter with the posture of someone setting down a weight they had carried for a very long time. "My son was a police officer," she began. Her voice was quiet but steady, the voice of a woman who had told this story before, but only to herself. "A good man, strong morals. He came back from the academy thinking he could clean up this place." She glanced at a framed photograph beside the register. A young man with sandy hair and a wide, confident smile, wearing a crisp uniform. The kind of smile that belonged to someone who still believed the world could be fixed. He noticed patterns, missing pets, suspicious vehicles passing through at odd hours, strangers who came and went and never stopped at any shop or gas station. He started asking questions, looking into places no one wanted him to look. She paused. The silence in the store thickened. He did not survive that choice. The words were plain, unadorned, and for that reason, they cut deeper than any dramatic telling could have. Beckett felt something cold settle in his stomach, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with winter. "If you found puppies," Helen continued, meeting his eyes with a gaze that held both warning and grief in equal measure, "someone may come looking for them. And trust me, these are not the kind of people you want to meet on the road." Beckett paid for his supplies. He gave Helen a faint nod, the kind that soldiers give to people who have earned their respect through suffering rather than rank. "Thank you," he said, "for the warning." "Be safe," she replied softly, "and watch your back." He stepped outside into the cold. The bell chimed one last time behind him. The sky had darkened since he entered, clouds settling low over the town like a lid being pressed onto a jar. He loaded the supplies into the truck bed and closed the tailgate, gently, careful not to wake the puppies sleeping on the passenger seat. Then he stopped. Across the parking lot, a black pickup truck idled. Its paint was dull, streaked with dried mud that no one had bothered to wash. The engine ran low and steady, a patient rumble, the sound of something that had been waiting. The driver's window rolled down. The man behind the wheel was in his mid-40s, tall, thick-set, with a square-shaped face and a short, coarse beard peppered with gray. His skin was weathered, and sun darkened his nose slightly crooked from a break that had healed without medical attention. His eyes were narrow, sharp, and utterly without warmth. They were the color of dishwater, flat and reflective, the kind of eyes that observed everything and felt nothing. He gave Beckett a slow, deliberate smile. Afternoon. Beckett did not return it. "Can I help you?" "Maybe." The man rested one thick arm on the window frame. His knuckles were scarred, the kind of scars that came from years of violence rather than labor. "Say you would not have seen a couple of German shepherd pups around. Would you black and tan? Little things. Real cute." Beckett kept his expression neutral. His pulse tightened beneath the calm, but nothing showed on the surface. 11 years of training had taught him to keep his face as still as a closed door. "Cannot say I have." The man's gaze drifted slowly, almost casually, toward the passenger seat of Beckett's truck. The military jacket lay just slightly askew over the sleeping puppies, not enough to reveal them, but enough to make Beckett's muscles go rigid beneath his coat. "Shame," the man said. The word lingered in the cold air like smoke. "Been looking for them. Lost them on the road. Terrible thing for little pups to freeze out here." His voice was smooth, polished even, but underneath the polish there was an edge, the kind of edge that does not come from anger. It comes from control, from the absolute certainty that what you want will eventually be yours one way or another. "If you see them," the man continued, "you let me know." Beckett nodded once. "Sure." The man smirked. The expression did not reach his eyes. It never would. "Good, I will be around." The truck rolled forward, then stopped. The man turned in his seat and looked back at Beckett with a stillness that had nothing casual about it. It was the stillness of a predator that has located its prey and is simply choosing the moment. Beckett met the gaze. He did not flinch. He did not blink. Snow drifted between them in the silence. Then the black truck pulled away, turning down the road toward the ridge, its taillights disappearing into the gray. Beckett exhaled, one slow, controlled breath. He climbed into his truck and looked at Copper and Scout. Their small bodies rose and fell beneath the blanket. Copper's paw twitched in a dream. Scout's nose was buried in the folds of the jacket. Before pulling out, Beckett checked the side mirror. At the far end of the lot, the black truck had stopped again, engine running, the driver's silhouette motionless behind the dark glass, watching. Beckett tightened his grip on the wheel and drove. He did not know who that man was. Not yet. But he knew one thing with the certainty that only comes from years of reading danger in the faces of strangers. That man was not looking for those puppies out of kindness. Night came early on the ridge. By 5 o'clock, the sky was black, the forest invisible beyond the ring of light thrown by the cabin windows. The temperature dropped so fast that the trees cracked and groaned under the weight of freezing sap sounds that carried through the dark like distant gunfire. Beckett had checked the locks 3 times. He had walked the perimeter of the cabin, studying the snow for fresh prints, finding none. He had stacked extra wood by the stove and filled every container he could find with water in case the pipes froze. He was preparing the way he had always prepared, methodically, thoroughly, as if the discipline of readiness could substitute for the peace he could not find. Copper and Scout were asleep on the rug in front of the stove, their bodies rising and falling in tandem. They had eaten well. Their fur was softer now, cleaner, beginning to lose the dull, brittle quality that starvation and cold had given it. Copper's scrape was healing. Scout's breathing, which had been shallow and uneven when Beckett first found them, had steadied into a rhythm that sounded almost content. They were recovering, faster than he had expected, as if the simple presence of warmth and food and a human heartbeat nearby was enough to undo what the cold had tried to finish. Beckett wished it worked that way for people too. He sat in the chair by the stove with a tin mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The fire popped and hissed. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls with a low, steady moan that sounded almost like a voice. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, and the moment betrayed him. The desert rushed in, not gradually, not with the slow approach of a memory being recalled. It came all at once the way it always did, like a door kicked open. The heat hit first. 120 degrees of dry, furious heat that turned the air into something solid, something you had to push through rather than breathe. Then the sound. The low thud of the explosion felt more in the chest than heard by the ears. Then the dust. Thick, brown choking, filling his mouth and his eyes and his lungs, until the world became nothing but grit and noise and the smell of burning metal. And then the voice. Beck, I am right here. I am right here. Just reach, just... The voice cut off. Not gradually, not with a fade. It stopped the way a light stops when the bulb breaks. One moment it existed full of life and fear and the desperate, furious love of a man who refused to die alone. And the next moment it was gone. And in its place, a silence so absolute that it had weight. A silence that Beckett had been carrying inside his chest for 4 months, every hour of every day. A silence shaped exactly like a man he could not save. Beckett's eyes flew open. He was gripping the arms of the chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. Sweat had broken out along his hairline despite the cold. His heart hammered against his ribs with the frantic rhythm of a trapped animal. Then something warm touched his hand. He looked down. Scout stood on his hind legs, his small front paws resting on Beckett's wrist. His dark eyes were wide fixed on Beckett's face with an expression that was impossible to misread. It was concern. Pure, uncomplicated, total concern. The kind that does not ask what happened or why you are hurting. The kind that simply says, I am here. I am not leaving. Scout licked Beckett's fingers. Once, twice. Soft, deliberate strokes of his small tongue against the knuckles that had been clenched tight enough to ache. Beckett stared at him. His breathing slowed. Not because he willed it, but because something in the puppy's touch had reached past the walls, past the training, past the silence that lived where his friend used to be and had found the part of him that was still capable of being calmed. Copper appeared a moment later, climbing into Beckett's lap with the graceless confidence of a puppy who has decided that every lap belongs to him. He turned twice, collapsed against Beckett's stomach, and let out a sound that was half yawn, half sigh. Beckett sat motionless. 2 small bodies pressed against him, 2 small heartbeats. The fire crackled, the wind moaned, and the desert retreated. Not gone, never gone, but quieter. Pushed back to the edge of the room by the presence of 2 creatures who did not know what war was and did not care. He rested one hand on Copper's back, the other on Scout's head, and he stayed like that in the firelight for a long time. The next morning, Edith Calloway arrived. She came unannounced, driving a faded blue sedan that looked as old as she was pulling up to the cabin with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had been making house calls in all weather for decades. She carried a canvas bag filled with medical supplies and a thermos of something that smelled like chamomile. "I wanted to check on the little ones," she said, when Beckett opened the door. But her hazel eyes were checking on him, too. He could feel it. He let her in. The puppies greeted her with wagging tails and clumsy enthusiasm, and she knelt to examine them with hands that were steady and sure and impossibly gentle. "They are coming along beautifully," she said, lifting Copper's paw to inspect the healing scrape. "Another few days of warmth and proper food, and they will be bouncing off the walls." She smiled, but when she looked up at Beckett, the smile softened into something more searching. "And how are you doing?" "Fine." She said it the way only women over 70 can say it, a single syllable that contained an entire rebuttal. She poured 2 cups from her thermos and handed him one. They sat by the stove. The puppies settled between them. Copper sprawled across Edith's lap, Scout leaning against Beckett's leg. The fire popped. Snow tapped against the windows. "You had a rough night," Edith said. It was not a question. Beckett looked at his hands. "I manage." "Of course you do. You are very good at managing. I can see that. But managing is not the same as living, is it?" He said nothing. The silence stretched, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of someone waiting patiently for a door to open on its own. Edith sipped her tea. "My husband was a soldier," she said quietly. "He served overseas for many years. Different war, different terrain, but the same ghosts. He came home and he was gentler than before, actually. But the gentleness had a weight to it. As if being soft with the world was the only way he could keep from breaking it. Or himself." She paused, stroking Copper's ear. "He never talked about what happened over there. Not once in 30 years of marriage. But every stray animal that crossed his path, every injured bird, every dog left on the side of the road, he brought them home. He built pens and shelters and feeding stations. He would wake at 3 a.m. to bottle feed a kitten that someone had abandoned in a ditch." Her voice grew quieter. "I asked him once why he did it, why the animals mattered so much. And he looked at me with this expression, the same expression you are wearing right now, and he said, 'Because they do not ask me what I have done. They only ask me to be kind.'" Beckett's throat tightened. "He passed 10 years ago," Edith continued, "and I made him a promise. I told him I would keep the clinic open, that I would keep doing what he started. Not because the town needed a vet, but because somewhere out there would always be another wounded creature that needed someone to say, 'You are safe now.'" She looked at Beckett with eyes that held no pity, only recognition. The recognition of someone who had watched a good man fight invisible wars for 3 decades and had loved him through every one of them. "You do not need to be strong, Beckett. You need to let yourself stay. That is a different kind of courage entirely." The words sank into him like heat from the stove. Slowly, deeply, reaching places that had been cold for so long he had forgotten they existed. Scout shifted against his leg and let out that same deep, total sigh. The sound of a small creature that has decided finally completely that it is safe. Beckett wanted to say something. He wanted to tell Edith about the desert and the silence and the voice that stopped. He wanted to tell her that he had driven to Idaho not to find peace, but to find a place empty enough to disappear in. He wanted to tell her that these two puppies, these two fragile, stubborn, impossible little creatures, had cracked open something inside him that he had spent years sealing shut, and he did not know whether to be grateful or terrified. But the words would not come. Not yet. So he simply nodded. And Edith, who understood silence the way most people understood speech, nodded back. Before she left standing in the doorway with snowflakes catching in her silver hair, she said one more thing. The sheriff mentioned something to me last week. There is talk of a large transport being organized, animals being moved out of the region. Whatever is happening with these missing pets, it is not slowing down. She paused. Be careful. And if those puppies start to feel like yours, trust that feeling. It is not weakness. It is the bravest thing a broken heart can do. She drove away in her old sedan, the taillights fading into the gray. Beckett stood in the doorway, the cold pressing against his face, and watched until the car disappeared. Behind him, Copper barked, a short, sharp sound, not alarmed, impatient. The bark of a puppy who wanted his person to come back inside where it was warm. Beckett turned. Scout sat just inside the door, looking up at him with those dark, knowing eyes. Waiting. Always waiting to see what Beckett would do, and then deciding based on that whether the world was safe enough to rest. Beckett stepped inside and closed the door, and outside in the gathering dusk, far down Pine Ridge Road, where the forest swallowed the last of the daylight, a pair of headlights blinked on. Then off, then on again, and then they were gone. The afternoon light on the third day was already dying when Beckett left the cabin. He had waited until Copper and Scout were asleep, their small bodies curled together on the blanket in front of the stove, their breathing slow and synchronized. He had added 3 extra logs to the fire, enough to keep the cabin warm for hours. He had checked the locks on both doors and every window. He had done everything a man does when he is about to walk into something dangerous and wants to make sure the things he loves are safe behind him. The things he loves. The phrase surfaced in his mind without permission, and he let it stay. He did not examine it. He did not push it away. He simply let it exist the way you let a match burn between your fingers when you are too tired to decide whether to light the candle or let it go out. He followed the tire tracks. They were faint, half buried under 2 days of snowfall, but Beckett's eyes had been trained to find traces that most people would never notice. A slight compression in the snow where weight had pressed down. A thin line where a tire had cut through the surface before the wind filled it in. The tracks led away from Pine Ridge Road and deeper into the forest along a narrow service road that did not appear on any map he had seen. The trees closed in around him. Ponderosa pines, tall and silent, their trunks rising like pillars in a cathedral that had been abandoned by its congregation. The snow was thicker here, untouched by plows or foot traffic, and Beckett moved through it with the deliberate silence of a man who had spent years entering buildings where every sound could be the last one he made. After 20 minutes, the forest opened, a clearing, perhaps 50 yards across, ringed by trees on every side, invisible from any road. In the center of it sat a structure that had once been a barn. The wood siding was faded to the color of old bone, warped by decades of rain and frost. The roof sagged under the weight of accumulated snow. The windows were boarded shut with planks that had been nailed from the inside. A rusted chain hung from the main door, but the padlock was missing. The chain dangled loose, swaying slightly in the wind, as if someone had removed the lock recently and had not bothered to replace it. Beckett approached with the caution that was woven into every fiber of his training. He moved along the tree line first, circling the clearing, studying the barn from every angle before committing to an approach. There were no vehicles, no fresh tracks in the immediate area, no sound except the wind and the occasional crack of a branch surrendering to the weight of ice. He reached the door, nudged it open with his shoulder. It groaned. A long, low protest of rusted hinges that echoed through the clearing like a voice calling out from somewhere underground. The smell hit him first. Stale grain, damp straw, and beneath those, something sharper. Something metallic and sour, the smell of old cages and confined animals and fear that had soaked into the wood over months or years. He stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by thin blades of light that sliced through gaps in the boarded windows. Rows of wire kennels lined both walls, stretching from the front of the barn to the back. Some were crushed or bent, their frames twisted, as if something heavy had been thrown against them. Others were still intact, their doors hanging open, locks dangling. Each kennel was sized for a medium dog, but the scratches on the floors of the cages told a different story. Multiple sets of claw marks overlapping, frantic, the marks of animals that had been packed too tightly into spaces too small. Torn pieces of cardboard littered the floor, the same red striped material he had found beside his cabin. Metal feeding bowls lay overturned near the center aisle. A water bucket, empty and cracked, sat in the corner. The place was cold, inhospitable. It had not been built for shelter. It had been built for storage, for holding. Beckett moved deeper into the barn, his boots silent on the frozen dirt floor. In the far corner, a wooden board hung crooked on the back wall, suspended by nails that had been driven in with more force than care. One corner sagged, pulling away from the wall, as if the board itself wanted to fall. Black marker had been used to write across its surface. The handwriting was swift, utilitarian, without flourish. The writing of someone who did this often and felt nothing while doing it. P14, male, 7 weeks. P15, male, 7 weeks. Batch 4, B, transport pending. Beckett read the words twice, then a third time. Each reading drove them deeper like nails into wood. P14, P15. That was what Copper and Scout had been. Not names. Not living creatures with heartbeats and amber eyes and the capacity to trust a stranger in the worst moment of their lives. Coded entries, inventory, line items in a ledger of exploitation written by a hand that saw no difference between a puppy and a product. His jaw tightened until pain crept along his teeth. His fists curled at his sides, and he stood motionless in the dim light of that rotting barn, staring at the board, feeling something build inside him that was not anger. It was deeper than anger. It was the kind of quiet, cold fury that does not shout. It simply decides. A sound behind him. He spun instantly, his body dropping into a defensive stance that his muscles knew by memory. Low center of gravity, weight balanced, hands open, ready. But it was only the wind pushing against the loose chain on the door. The metal clinked against the frame, a small hollow sound that had no threat behind it. Still, it took Beckett several seconds to uncoil. The adrenaline faded slowly, leaving his hands tingling and his heart beat louder than it should have been. He moved through the rest of the barn systematically, checking every corner, reading every sign. Boot prints hardened into mud along the far wall. Not old. A cigarette butt crushed beside the door, the paper still white, not yet yellowed by exposure. A stained piece of canvas tarp bunched in the corner, recently moved based on the dust pattern around it. He crouched and unfolded the tarp. In the lower right corner, sewn into the fabric with red thread, was a small emblem, a stylized eagle with its wings spread wide. Not military issue, not law enforcement. Something handmade. Something that belonged to no official organization, but served as a marker nonetheless. A brand. The way a business stamps its property. Except this business dealt in living things. Beckett folded the tarp and tucked it inside his coat. Evidence. Proof. Something tangible to hold against the growing weight of what he was beginning to understand. Then he heard footsteps. Heavy ones crunching through the snow outside. He tensed, not from fear, from readiness. But the rhythm was wrong. Too slow. Too uneven. Not the stride of someone approaching with intent, but the careful, measured pace of someone who was old and did not trust the ice beneath their feet. The barn door creaked open. Gray light spilled across the floor. "Beckett, you in here?" A familiar voice, steady, warm, carrying a tremor that came from the cold rather than from nerves. He exhaled and lowered his guard. Helen Gentry stepped inside, wrapped in a thick brown winter coat with a wool scarf wound tightly around her neck. Her silver hair was tucked beneath a knitted beanie, and her cheeks were flushed red from the walk. Behind her came a man Beckett had not met before. He was in his early 70s, tall but thin, with a posture that bent slightly forward as if he had spent decades leaning into wind. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his hazel eyes moved constantly scanning the barn with the trained awareness of someone who had spent a lifetime observing things that most people overlooked. He wore a heavy canvas jacket and boots that had seen more winters than Beckett had been alive. This was Earl Jennings, retired forest ranger, the kind of man small towns referred to by his last name, and a title that had less to do with his job and everything to do with respect. "We saw your tracks," Helen said softly. Her breath formed small white clouds in the frigid air. "I had a feeling you would come here alone." Beckett stood slowly. "I did not want to drag anyone into this." Helen's expression tightened. She looked around the barn, and her gaze caught on the empty kennels, the overturned bowls, the scratches inside the cages. Something in her face collapsed. Not dramatically, quietly, the way a wall gives way from the inside. "My son came here once," she said, following a lead he had pieced together from reports and rumors. She paused. This was the last place he was seen alive. The air in the barn changed. It thickened with a grief so old and so deep that it had become part of the structure, soaked into the walls, alongside the fear of every animal that had ever been held here. Beckett bowed his head. "I am sorry." Helen offered a small, trembling smile. Not forgiveness, not closure. Just the acknowledgement that sorrow, when shared, weighs slightly less. "I never asked for justice," she whispered. "But I always hoped someone braver than me would look." Earl stepped forward. His voice was low-measured, the voice of a man who chose words the way a carpenter chooses nails. "I have been watching this area for months," he said. "Hunters reported strange lights, unmarked trucks moving at night on roads that lead nowhere. I set up trail cameras on 3 approaches to this clearing." He knelt beside one of the kennels and tapped the wire mesh with a gloved finger. "This is not random. It is organized, systematic." Beckett showed him the wooden board with the coded entries. Earl's face darkened. "Pups," he said quietly. "P14, P15. They use numbers to avoid attachment. Easier to move product when it does not have a name." "Copper and Scout," Beckett said. His voice was firm, almost fierce. "Not numbers. Helen placed a gentle hand on his arm. You saved them. But whoever took them before those men will not just stop. Earl straightened slowly, his knees cracking in the cold. He looked at Beckett with an expression that held something more than concern. It held the weight of a secret he had been carrying alone for too long. There is something else, Earl said. Something I have not told anyone because I was not certain. But after what you found here, I think you need to know. He walked to the back of the barn where a second door led to a smaller room that had once been used for grain storage. The door hung open on one hinge. Inside, wooden shelves lined the walls, most of them empty, but on the lowest shelf, wedged behind a rotting feed bag, Earl pulled out a battered metal box. He opened it on the floor between them. Inside were photographs, printed on cheap paper, slightly blurred, taken from a distance with a long lens. They showed a large property somewhere rural, fenced enclosures, dogs, dozens of them in pens that were barely large enough to turn around in. In several of the photos, men stood around a circular pit dug into the earth. The pit had walls made of plywood stained dark. Beckett stared at the images. The understanding came not all at once, but in layers, each one heavier than the last. This is not just about selling puppies, he said. No, Earl replied. It never was. He spread the photographs across the floor, arranging them in sequence. They breed them, Earl said. German shepherds, pit bulls, Rottweilers, dozens at a time in conditions no living creature should endure. The ones that show aggression, early the ones that snap and snarl and fight for food, those are the valuable ones. They get separated, trained, conditioned through starvation and isolation until violence is the only language they understand. Then, they get sold into a circuit of underground fighting rings that stretches across 4 states: Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Washington. Maybe further. The money involved is significant. Tens of thousands per event. Hundreds of thousands per season. He paused. His hazel eyes, which had been steady through every word, flickered with something that looked like nausea held at bay by sheer willpower. And the ones that do not show aggression. He continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The ones that are too small, too gentle, too trusting. The ones that lick your hand instead of biting it. The ones that curl into your lap instead of lunging at the cage. Those ones have no value. They are waste product. He did not say what happened to them. The barn, the frozen road, the 2 trembling puppies lifting their paws toward a stranger in the snow, those things said it for him. Beckett looked at the photographs and saw Copper's face, saw Scout's trembling body in the snow, saw 2 6-week-old puppies lifted their paws toward a stranger on a frozen road because they had been deemed worthless by men who measured life in profit and violence. They had been thrown away, discarded in a blizzard, left to freeze because they were too kind to fight. The crack that had opened in Beckett's chest 3 days ago split wide. How long has this been going on? He asked. His voice was steady, but beneath the steadiness was something molten, something that had no name, but burned. Years, Earl said. Maybe longer. Your friend Helen's son got close to figuring it out. Too close. He looked at Helen, whose face had gone pale. I am sorry. I should have said something sooner. But I did not have proof. Just pictures and suspicions. Helen shook her head slowly. You have proof now, Earl nodded. He reached into the box and pulled out one more photograph. This one was clearer than the others taken from closer range. It showed a man standing beside a large black pickup truck loading crates into the bed. The man was thick-set, square-faced, with a crooked nose and a coarse beard. Vince Decker. His name came up in 3 separate wildlife violation reports over the past 2 years, Earl said. Each time the charges were dropped, witnesses recanted, evidence disappeared. He has connections. People in the county who look the other way, because it is easier than looking directly at what he does. Beckett picked up the photograph and studied it. The man in the picture wore the same expression he had seen in the parking lot. That slow, controlled smile, that absolute certainty. There is more, Earl continued, and his voice dropped lower. I intercepted radio chatter 2 nights ago on a frequency that local haulers use. Someone is organizing a large transport, multiple vehicles, dozens of animals. The pickup is scheduled for the night after tomorrow. He let the words settle. They are cleaning house, Earl said, moving everything out of the region before anyone puts the pieces together. Every animal they have, every cage, every scrap of paper with a number on it, all of it loaded into trucks and driven across state lines in a single night. By morning, this barn will be empty. The kennels will be gone. The board on the wall will be firewood. And anyone who tries to prove what happened here will find nothing but an old building full of dust. He looked at Beckett with an expression that carried the gravity of a man who understood exactly what he was saying. They have done this before. In other counties, other states. They operate, they extract, and they vanish. Like a wildfire that burns everything and moves on before anyone can draw a map of the damage. Beckett felt the blood slow in his veins, and Copper and Scout, Earl met his eyes. They are loose inventory, evidence that escaped, the kind of evidence that can tie this entire operation to specific people in specific places. He paused. They will not leave them alive. They cannot afford to. The barn was silent. The wind pushed against the walls. The chain on the door swayed and clinked. Helen spoke first. Her voice was thin but clear, carrying the particular strength of a woman who had spent years turning grief into something that could bear weight. Then we do not let them. Beckett looked at her, then at Earl. 2 people in their late 60s and early 70s standing in a rotting barn in the middle of winter, offering to help a stranger fight something that had already cost one of them a son. He did not deserve it. He knew that. He did not deserve any of this. Not the trust of 2 small dogs. Not the kindness of an old veterinarian. Not the courage of a grieving mother and a retired ranger who had been watching and waiting for someone to finally do what needed to be done. But deserving it, he was beginning to understand, had never been the point. He tucked the tarp with the eagle emblem deeper into his coat. He placed the photographs carefully back into the metal box and handed it to Earl. "Keep this somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere they would never think to look." Earl nodded. Beckett turned toward the door. The light outside had faded to a deep blue-gray, the color the sky turns when it is deciding whether to storm. He stopped in the doorway and looked back at the rows of empty cages, at the coated board on the wall, at the place where Copper and Scout had been nothing more than numbers waiting to be erased. "I need to get back to them," he said quietly. Helen touched his arm as he passed her. "Be careful tonight." He did not promise. Promises felt too fragile for what was coming. He walked back through the forest as the last light drained from the sky. The snow had begun to fall again, thicker now, the flakes large and heavy, the kind of snowfall that comes before a serious storm. By morning, the tracks leading to the barn would be buried. The evidence of his visit would vanish under white silence. But the truth would not vanish. Not anymore. When he reached the cabin, Copper was waiting at the window, his small face pressed against the glass ears' perked tail wagging the moment Beckett's silhouette appeared through the trees. Scout sat just behind him, watchful as always, but his tail wagged too. Beckett opened the door and knelt. Both puppies rushed to him, climbing over each other, licking his hands, pressing their warm bodies against his chest. He held them, not carefully, the way he had the first day, but tightly. The way you hold something when you finally understand what it means to you. "Someone is looking for you," he murmured into their fur. "But they will not get you. Not while I am breathing." He stood and carried them to the window. The snow fell harder now, thick curtains of white swallowing the forest beyond the clearing. The world looked quiet, peaceful even, but far down the ridge, barely visible through the storm, something caught his eye. Not headlights this time. Something worse. Tire tracks. Fresh ones. Cut deep into the snow on the service road below the cabin, curving toward the clearing and stopping less than 100 yards from the front porch. Whoever had driven there had come close. Far closer than the watchers in the forest 2 nights ago. And beside the tracks pressed into the snow in a line that led directly to the cabin door were boot prints. Heavy. Deliberate. The same stride pattern Beckett had memorized on the morning he found the first set circling the walls. They had been here while he was at the barn, while the cabin was empty and unlocked and the puppies were sleeping inside. He looked at the front door. It was closed. He had locked it before leaving. But now, in the last gray light of the dying afternoon, he noticed something he had missed when he first arrived. A thin scratch on the metal plate around the keyhole. Fresh. The mark of a tool testing the lock. They had tried to get in. Beckett's arms tightened around Copper and Scout. The puppies pressed closer, sensing the shift in his body, the sudden rigidity in his shoulders, the way his breathing had gone shallow and controlled. They had not just found him. They had come for them. And the next time, he knew with absolute certainty, they would not stop at trying the lock. The storm arrived on the 4th night as if it had been waiting for permission. It did not build gradually the way most winter storms do, gathering clouds and dropping temperature in slow, polite increments. This one came all at once, slamming into the ridge with a fury that shook the cabin walls and turned the forest into a howling white void. The wind did not blow. It attacked. It threw snow sideways in sheets so thick that the tree line only 30 yards from the porch disappeared completely. The world beyond the cabin windows became nothing but moving white and roaring sound, as if the earth itself had been erased. Beckett had felt it coming. The barometric pressure had been dropping since late afternoon, a heaviness in the air that pressed against the sinuses and made the silence feel louder. By 6 o'clock, the first gusts had rattled the chimney pipe. By 7, the power was gone. By 8, the cell phone on the counter showed no signal at all, just a blank screen reflecting the firelight. They were cut off. He had prepared as much as he could. The stove was loaded with enough wood to burn through the night. Water containers were filled. The door was bolted. His boots and coat were set beside the back exit ready. He had lived through enough operations in hostile territory to know that preparation was the only thing that separated survival from luck. And he had never been a man who trusted luck. Copper and Scout sensed the change before the storm even hit. By late afternoon, Copper had stopped playing. He paced the cabin in tight circles, his ears rotating like small radar dishes, pausing at each window to press his nose against the glass and stare into the darkening forest. His body was rigid, his tail low, his breathing quick and shallow. Every few minutes he would let out a low growl, barely audible, directed at nothing visible, but aimed with absolute certainty at something beyond the walls. Scout was worse. He had retreated to the corner beside the stove, pressing himself flat against the floor, his chin resting on his paws, his dark eyes wide and unblinking. He did not pace. He did not whimper. He simply watched. The way prey watches when it knows a predator is near, but cannot see it yet. Beckett knelt beside them. He placed one hand on Copper's back and the other on Scout's head. Both puppies were trembling, not from cold. The cabin was warm. They were trembling from something deeper, something their instincts understood that his mind was still assembling. "Easy," he murmured. "We are all right." But the words rang hollow, even to him. Because the truth was that he did not know if they were all right. He did not know who was out there. He did not know how many. He did not know when they would come, only that they would. The headlights in the forest last night had confirmed what the footprints around the cabin had suggested 2 days before. Someone knew where they were. Someone was watching. And tonight, with the storm providing cover and the phone lines dead, and the nearest neighbor miles away behind walls of blowing snow tonight, was the night they would come. He checked the locks one final time. Front door, back door, every window. Then he sat in the chair beside the stove and waited. The wind screamed. The fire crackled. And at 11 minutes past 9, Copper stopped pacing. He went rigid. Every muscle in his small body locked tight. His ears pointed forward, his head turned toward the front door with a focus so intense that his entire frame seemed to vibrate with it. A growl rose from his chest, not the soft, uncertain growl of a puppy testing its voice. This was different. This was low and steady and full of a conviction that seemed impossible from a creature that weighed less than 8 pounds. Scout rose from the corner, slowly. His ears flattened against his skull. His fur bristled along his spine. He pressed himself against Copper's side, and together the two puppies faced the door. Then Beckett heard it, a sound beneath the wind, metal on metal. The faintest scrape, almost inaudible, the sound of something being tested. The front door latch. Someone was on the porch. His pulse did not spike. It slowed, the way it always did, the way his body had been conditioned to respond to threat after 11 years of entering rooms where death waited on the other side. His vision sharpened. His hearing expanded. His breathing dropped to a shallow, silent rhythm that would not give away his position. He rose from the chair without making a sound. Copper barked, sharp, loud, furious. The sound split the cabin like a crack of thunder, and for a moment, everything stopped. The scraping at the latch stopped. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Even Scout, who rarely made a sound, added his voice to his brother's, a higher, thinner bark that wobbled with fear but did not retreat. They were not hiding. They were warning. A second impact hit the door. Harder. The hinges groaned. Snow blew through the gap beneath the frame in a thin white ribbon. Beckett moved. He crossed the cabin in 4 strides, scooped Copper under one arm and Scout under the other, and pressed them both inside his coat against his chest. Their hearts hammered against his ribs, frantic and tiny, like 2 small drums beating in panic. But they did not squirm. They did not fight. They pressed close and held on the way they had held on the first day he found them, with that same desperate total trust. Outside, a man's voice cut through the storm, low, irritated, sharp with authority. A second voice answered, deeper, impatient. The voice of someone who had been told to wait and was tired of waiting. A third impact hit the front door. The bolt held, but the wood around it splintered. Beckett did not wait for a fourth. He crossed to the back of the cabin to the small storage room that opened onto the rear woods. He had left this door unlocked deliberately, the way a soldier always leaves a secondary exit prepared. He turned the handle and pushed. The storm rushed in. The cold was staggering. It hit his face like a closed fist, driving the breath from his lungs in one violent exhale. Snow blasted against his skin, his eyes, his throat. The wind roared so loudly that the sounds from inside the cabin disappeared instantly, swallowed by the white fury of the blizzard. But the forest was there. Dark, dense, churning with snow, but there. 30 yards of open ground, and then the tree line. Cover. Concealment. The terrain he had been trained to own. He ran. His boots punched through the snow with each stride, sinking to mid-shin, the drifts grabbing at his legs like hands trying to hold him back. He hunched forward, shielding the puppies with his body, using his shoulders to break through the wind. The shoulder clawed at every exposed inch of skin, but the adrenaline burning through his blood made it irrelevant. He had operated in worse. He had survived worse. And he had never had a reason to survive that mattered as much as the two small hearts beating against his chest. Behind him, the cabin door finally gave way. He heard it even through the storm. A crash. Voices shouting. Boots slamming against wooden floorboards. Then a man's voice, louder than the rest, barking an order that the wind tore apart before it reached him. He did not look back. He reached the tree line and plunged into the forest. The forest at night in a blizzard was a world without rules. Snow erased every landmark. Wind changed direction every few seconds, disorienting even the most experienced navigators. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet, turning the trees into gray ghosts that appeared and vanished without warning. The cold was not just a temperature. It was a presence, a predator in its own right, patient and relentless and perfectly willing to wait for the body's defenses to fail. Beckett moved through it the way water moves through stone, finding the cracks, following the paths of least resistance, using the terrain instead of fighting it. He headed uphill toward Dragonfly Hill, a steep ridge of rock and frozen brush that rose above the valley floor like a broken spine. The footing was treacherous. Ice beneath the snow-loose shale beneath the ice, every step a negotiation between speed and stability. But Beckett had spent years navigating terrain far more hostile than this in places where the ground itself could be wired to explode, and his body remembered what his mind did not need to think about. He zigzagged through the trees, never moving in a straight line, using the pines as cover and the wind as camouflage. Every 30 yards he paused, turned, and listened. The storm made it difficult to isolate sounds, but his ears had been trained to filter, to separate the relevant from the noise, the way a radio operator pulls a signal from static. Behind him, headlights appeared. They swept through the forest like searchlights, bouncing crazily as the vehicles fought the terrain. One set, then two. The beams cut through the snow in sharp white cones, illuminating tree trunks and bushes, and flying ice in brief, violent flashes. Someone had followed him into the woods. Beckett changed direction, veering hard to the west where the slope steepened and the rocks began. He climbed using his free hand, the other arm locked around the puppies inside his coat. Copper had gone silent, his body rigid against Beckett's chest, his ears flat. Scout trembled, but he did not whimper. He pressed his nose into the hollow of Beckett's throat and breathed. Halfway up the ridge, Beckett stopped, not because of the trucks, not because of the cold, not because of the men crashing through the forest below him with flashlights and fury. He stopped because the desert came back. This time it did not announce itself with sound. It came through touch. One moment his hand was gripping frozen rock on an Idaho hillside. The next moment his fingers were closing around something warm. A hand. A human hand reaching through smoke so thick it turned the air to mud. He was back in the hallway. The narrow, crumbling corridor with exposed rebar and shattered concrete. The air temperature was 120 degrees and rising because somewhere behind the walls, something was burning. The smoke was thick, acrid tasting of chemical accelerant and old plaster. Visibility was less than 3 feet. But this time, the memory did not give him the voice first. It gave him the hand. Garrett's hand. He could feel every detail of it. The calluses on the palm from years of handling weapons. The wedding ring on the fourth finger, the one Garrett spun when he was nervous, the one his wife had engraved with a date Beckett had never asked about. The grip fierce and absolute, the grip of a man who believed with every cell in his body that his best friend would pull him through. Their fingers locked. Beckett pulled. He pulled with everything he had, with muscles trained to drag 200 pounds of gear through waist-deep water, and for one impossible second, he felt Garrett moving toward him, coming through, alive. And then the ceiling dropped. The concrete slab fell between them with a sound that was not a sound at all, but a silence, the most violent silence Beckett had ever known. Garrett's hand was in his grip, and then it was not. The fingers slipped. The wedding ring scraped across Beckett's palm. And then there was nothing. Nothing where a man named Garrett had been a man who had a wife and a daughter he had never met, and a laugh that could fill a room and a habit of singing off key during long transports, and who was now in the space of a single heartbeat, simply gone. Beckett had never told anyone the worst part. The worst part was not that Garrett died. The worst part was that for one fraction of a second, he had held him. He had felt the life in that grip, and it had slipped through his fingers anyway. That was the silence he carried, not the silence of absence, the silence of almost. Beckett's knees buckled. He dropped to one knee in the snow, his vision splitting between two worlds, the white storm in front of him and the brown dust behind his eyes. His breathing fractured. His hands shook. The carefully maintained architecture of his composure, the discipline, the control, the ability to function under pressure that had defined him for his entire adult life. All of it cracked at once like ice on a lake that has been thawing from beneath. He could not move. He could not think. He was here and he was there, and he was nowhere trapped between a mountain and a memory, and the cold was in his bones, and the fire was in his head, and everything was noise and silence at the same time. Then Scout moved, a small warm body shifting against his chest. A tiny nose pressing upward, touching the underside of Beckett's jaw. And then a sound, so quiet that no one in the world except Beckett could have heard it above the storm. A whimper, soft, gentle, not a cry of fear, a call. The sound a small creature makes when it is trying to bring someone back from a place they have gone alone. Beckett blinked. The desert faded. The dust settled. The silence retreated, not gone, never gone, but pushed back to the edges by a sound so small it should not have had the power to reach him. But it did. Because it was not trying to fix him. It was not trying to be strong. It was simply saying in the only language a 7-week-old puppy knows I am here. Come back. He looked down. Scout's dark eyes stared up at him through the opening in his coat. Steady. Unwavering. Waiting. Copper stirred beside his brother. His small paw pressed against Beckett's chest right over his heart and held there. Beckett breathed. One breath. Deep. Full. The first real breath he had taken in minutes that felt like hours. He was not in the desert. He was on a frozen hillside in a blizzard with 2 puppies who needed him to stand up and keep moving. 2 puppies who had not asked him to be healed or whole or free of ghosts. They had only asked him to stay. And for the first time since the building collapsed and the reaching stopped, Beckett chose to stay. Not because a mission required it, not because a commanding officer ordered it, but because 2 small, trembling, impossibly brave creatures had looked at him in the snow and decided he was worth trusting. And he would not, could not, would never let that trust be wrong. He stood. His legs held. The wind tore at his coat, but he leaned into it the way his body had always leaned into resistance. And he climbed. Below him, the trucks fanned out across the lower slope. Flashlight beams crisscrossed in the storm. A man shouted, another cursed. The voice was thick with frustration. The frustration of someone accustomed to control, discovering that control means nothing in a blizzard on terrain that does not care who you are. Beckett found a narrow crevice in the rock face, just wide enough for 1 man and 2 puppies. He slipped inside, positioning himself behind a boulder that blocked the wind. The cold eased slightly. Not much, but enough. And then from far below, a different sound reached him through the storm. Not engines, not shouting. A voice. Old and fierce and shaking with effort, but burning with a fire that no blizzard on earth could extinguish. Beckett. Edith Calloway's voice, rising from somewhere near the base of Dragonfly Hill. Beckett, we are coming. Another voice joined. Helen Gentry's thinner, breathless, but just as determined. And then through the swirling white, Beckett saw them. Lanterns. Dozens of them. Rising through the blizzard like living things carried by figures who climb the hill in a wavering line, their lights swaying with each step, their shapes half visible through the snow. The people of Willow Bend. The baker with the rosy cheeks. The postman with shaking hands. The tall woman who ran the hardware store. Men and women who had heard somehow through some chain of phone calls and pounded doors and shouted warnings that traveled faster than the storm that something was happening on the ridge, that someone needed help, that 2 old women had driven into the blizzard because a man and 2 puppies were in danger, and the kind of people who lived in Willow Bend did not sit inside when that kind of thing was happening. The lanterns climbed. The glow spread. Orange and gold and amber light pushed against the darkness, refracting through the falling snow until the entire hillside shimmered with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with what human beings are capable of when they decide together that the darkness will not win tonight. The men from the truck saw it too. The lights, the people, the sheer, undeniable fact that they were no longer operating in shadow. Vince Decker's voice carried through the storm, sharp and profane. His operation ran on darkness, on fear, on the understanding that no one would come. No one would look. No one would climb a frozen hill in the worst storm of the season for 2 dogs and a stranger. He had been wrong. And then Copper did something that no one expected. The small puppy wriggled free from Beckett's coat. Before Beckett could grab him, Copper scrambled up the boulder at the mouth of the crevice, planted all four paws on the frozen stone, lifted his head into the howling wind, and barked. Not the tentative bark of a frightened puppy, not the warning bark he had given at the cabin door. This was something else entirely. This was a bark that rang across the ridge like a bell, clear and sharp and impossibly loud for a creature his size. A declaration. A signal. The sound of a small, brave life announcing to every person on that hill that he was here, that he was alive, and that he would not be silenced. The lanterns turned toward the sound. Edith's voice cracked through the wind. There up the ridge, Sheriff Tom Hadley's floodlight swept the slope and found the crevice, found Beckett, found two tiny puppies on a frozen boulder, one barking with everything he had, the other pressed close to the man who had carried them through the storm. Vince Decker broke from the tree line in a desperate lunge toward the upper slope. His heavy frame crashed through the snow, his boots slipping on ice, his face twisted with the particular rage of a man who sees everything he has built collapsing around him. Behind him, Loomis stumbled, tripped, fell face first into a drift, and did not get up immediately. The deputies closed in from three directions. The lanterns converged. The light grew brighter, warmer, more certain with every step. There was nowhere left to hide. Vince made one last push toward the trees. His boot hit a sheet of ice buried beneath the snow, and his legs went out from under him. He fell hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs in a grunt that the wind carried away. Before he could rise, two deputies were on him, pressing him into the snow, the blue and red of their flashers now visible through the blizzard like a second set of lanterns. Beckett stepped out of the crevice, holding Scout securely against his chest. Copper bounded down from the boulder and ran to him, tail spinning wildly despite the cold, despite the fear, despite everything. Sheriff Hadley's voice boomed through the storm. "Hear you all right." Beckett stepped into the light. They were after the puppies. Hadley's lined face hardened beneath his gray mustache. "Not anymore." The lanterns gathered on the ridge. The wind, as if it too had been holding its breath, eased just slightly. The snow continued to fall, but softer, now gentler, the way snow falls when the worst has passed, and the world is beginning to remember what quiet sounds like. Copper pressed against Beckett's boot. Scout nuzzled deeper into his coat. And all around them, the warm light of carried lanterns turned the frozen hillside into something that looked, for just a moment, like the safest place on earth. Helen reached him first. Her face was wet, though whether from snow or tears he could not tell. Her voice broke on the only words that mattered. "You brought them back, all three of you." Edith placed a hand on his arm. Her grip was firm despite the cold, despite her 70 years, despite the fact that she had just climbed a hill in a blizzard that would have turned back women half her age. "Let us get the little ones warm," she said softly. Beckett nodded. He held the puppies close, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to breathe fully, deeply, completely. They were safe. He had kept his promise. The storm broke sometime before dawn. No one noticed the exact moment it happened. There was no dramatic silence, no sudden stillness, no cinematic pause in the wind. The blizzard simply lost its fury, the way anger loses its heat when it has raged long enough. The gusts softened. The snow thinned. The clouds, which had pressed the sky flat for days, lifted just enough to let the first pale suggestion of morning slide across the ridge. Dragonfly Hill looked like a battlefield that had chosen the wrong war. Tire tracks scarred the lower slope in chaotic arcs where the trucks had skidded and spun. Broken branches lay scattered across the snow where men had crashed through the forest in pursuit of a ghost they could not catch. Boot prints, dozens of them, crisscrossed the hillside in every direction, a tangled record of the night's confusion. And at the base of the ridge, where the access road met the tree line, 3 black trucks sat nose to tail, their engines cold. Their doors hanging open, their interiors already filling with fresh snow. Beside the trucks, 5 men sat on the frozen ground with their hands secured behind their backs. Deputies stood over them, breath-steaming shoulders, squared flashlights still on, despite the growing light. The red and blue of the patrol car flashers rotated in slow, steady sweeps that painted the snow in alternating color, the visual language of consequence arriving at last. Vince Decker sat apart from the others. His coat was torn at the shoulder where he had fallen on the ice. A thin line of blood had dried along his temple from the impact. His crooked nose, which had been broken years ago and never properly set, looked even more pronounced in the harsh light of the flood lamps. But it was his expression that Beckett noticed most. Not rage, not fear, not the desperate calculation of a man searching for an exit. Emptiness. The flat, colorless blankness of a man who had operated for so long in the confidence that he was untouchable that the experience of being touched, of being caught, of being held accountable had not yet fully registered. He sat in the snow and stared at nothing, and the nothing stared back. And for the first time since Beckett had met him in that parking lot, Vince Decker looked exactly like what he was. A man who had built his life on the suffering of creatures that could not speak for themselves, and who had finally run out of darkness to hide in. Loomis beside him was less composed. The thinner man rocked slightly his jaw, working his eyes darting between the deputies and the tree line, as if still calculating an escape that no longer existed. His mismatched gloves were soaked through. His teeth chattered. He looked, Beckett thought, like a man who had followed someone else's certainty into a place from which there was no following anyone back out. Sheriff Tom Hadley stood at the center of it all with the immovable calm of a man who had spent 30 years in law enforcement and had learned that the most important thing about authority was not how loudly you wielded it, but how steadily. He was in his late 50s, burly, with a thick salt and pepper mustache and green eyes that had seen enough to fill several lifetimes and had chosen, despite all of it, to keep looking. His brown uniform jacket was dusted with snow. His boots were caked with mud and ice from the climb. He held a clipboard in one hand and a floodlight in the other, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular gravity of someone who understands that justice is not a performance. It is a record. A careful, patient, permanent record. 3 vehicles. Hadley said, reading from the clipboard as a deputy cataloged the contents of the trucks. Wire kennels, restraints, transport crates, documentation showing pickup routes across 4 counties. He looked up at Vince. And a loaded firearm under the driver's seat of the lead vehicle. Vince said nothing. Hadley continued. We also recovered a canvas tarp bearing an emblem that matches materials found at the property on Ridgeline Service Road. He paused. The barn. At the word barn, something flickered across Vince's face. Brief, involuntary. The faintest tightening around his eyes as if the mention of that place had touched a nerve he thought he had severed long ago. Beckett stepped forward. He had been standing at the edge of the scene copper in one arm, and Scout pressed against his chest inside his coat. Both puppies were calm now. Exhausted, cold, but calm. Their eyes were open, watching everything with the quiet alertness of creatures who understood in whatever way animals understand that the thing they had been running from was no longer running after them. He reached into his coat and pulled out the folded tarp with the red eagle emblem. He handed it to Hadley without a word. Hadley took it, examined the stitching, looked at the emblem, then looked at Beckett. "Where did you find this?" "In the barn," along with a board listing coded entries for animals, batch numbers, transport schedules. He paused. P14 and P15. Those were the numbers assigned to these two puppies. Hadley's jaw tightened beneath his mustache. He turned to one of his deputies. "Get county forensics on the phone. I want that barn sealed and processed before noon. Every scrap of paper, every fiber, every print." He looked back at the men on the ground. "And contact the State Bureau. This is not a local operation. This crosses jurisdictional lines." The deputy nodded and moved to the patrol car. Hadley turned back to Beckett. His expression softened just slightly the way stone softens when light hits it at the right angle. "You did good work tonight, Hale." Beckett shook his head. "I just ran. You protected them." Hadley glanced at Copper and Scout. "And you gathered evidence that is going to unravel something a lot of people worked very hard to keep hidden." He lowered his voice. "Helen Gentry's son, Officer Gentry. He filed reports about suspicious activity in this area 3 years ago. Nobody followed up. I was not sheriff then, and the man who was..." He let the sentence trail off. The silence that filled the gap said more than any accusation could have. "This evidence," Hadley continued, tapping the tarp, "connects the current operation to the same network her son was investigating. It may not bring him back, but it gives his work meaning. It gives his mother something she has not had in 3 years." He did not say the word. He did not need to. It hung in the cold morning air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Closure. A deputy approached with a form. Hadley signed it, then looked at Beckett one more time. "I am going to need you to stay in the area for a while, as a witness. The state investigation will require statements, depositions, possibly testimony." Beckett understood what that meant. It meant not leaving. It meant remaining in Willow Bend in the cabin on Pine Ridge in this small town where people climbed hills in blizzards for strangers and carried lanterns through the dark because they believed that light was worth the effort. It meant staying. 3 days ago, that word would have felt like a cage, a trap, the opposite of the disappearance he had come to Idaho to find. Now standing in the early morning light with 2 puppies pressed against his heart and the last traces of a storm dissolving into pale sky, the word felt different. It felt like a choice. "I will be here," Beckett said. Hadley nodded. And in that nod, small and practical and entirely without ceremony, something was settled. Not just a legal arrangement. An understanding that Beckett Hale, who had spent years moving through the world without stopping, had found a reason to stand still. Helen Gentry arrived 20 minutes later, driven down from the ridge by a neighbor whose truck had 4-wheel drive and the good sense to go slowly. She stepped out into the morning light and stopped. She looked at the trucks, the handcuffed men, the deputies, the floodlights. She looked at all of it with an expression that moved through her face like weather across a valley. Disbelief first, then recognition. Then something that cracked open behind her eyes and spilled down her cheeks in 2 silent, steady lines. She did not sob. She did not collapse. She stood in the snow, 68 years old, silver-haired, wearing the same thick brown coat she had worn into the barn, and she cried the way a woman cries when grief that has been held for 3 years finally finds a crack wide enough to escape through. Beckett walked to her. He did not speak. He simply stood beside her close enough that she could feel his presence far enough that she could have her moment. Copper, sensing the shift in the air, leaned out from Beckett's arm and licked Helen's fingers. A small, warm gesture. The kind of gesture that says nothing and means everything. Helen laughed. A broken, wet, beautiful laugh. She scratched Copper's ear and looked at Beckett through her tears. "He would have liked you," she said softly. "My son. He would have liked you very much." Beckett swallowed around the tightness in his throat. "I think I would have liked him too." 3 weeks later, the winter had not ended. It would not end for another month at least. But it had softened the way winters do when the worst has passed and the world begins to remember that it knows how to be gentle. The snow still lay thick across Willow Bend, but the light had changed. The days were longer by minutes, the sun a little higher, the shadows a little shorter. And in that slow, quiet shift, something new had begun to grow. Beckett Hale stood outside the sheriff's office on a Tuesday morning, his breath curling into the cold air, his hands bare despite the temperature, because the puppies did not like the feeling of gloves when he held them. Copper sat at his left boot. He was sturdier now, his legs no longer wobbling, his chest broader, his ears standing upright with the alert confidence of a dog that had decided the world was a place worth paying attention to. His tail flicked in small certain arcs, the way a metronome keeps time, not anxious, assured. Scout sat at his right ankle, smaller, always smaller, but quicker in ways that mattered. His dark eyes moved constantly, reading every face, every sound, every shift in the wind. He had developed a habit of pressing his body against Beckett's leg whenever they were in public, not from fear, but from preference, as if he had chosen his place in the world and saw no reason to leave it. Their fur had grown thick and glossy, black and tan, rich and warm, catching the winter sunlight in ways that made them look almost golden at the edges. They were barely 3 months old, but they carried themselves with a steadiness that belied their age. As if surviving what they had survived had given them access to something that most creatures take years to learn: trust. Not blind trust. Earned trust. The kind that has been tested by cold and darkness and the worst that people can do and has come through on the other side still intact. Sheriff Hadley emerged from the building with a manila folder. He handed it to Beckett. "Official," he said. "They are yours." Beckett accepted the adoption papers. He glanced at them, but only briefly. His eyes returned to the puppies almost immediately, as if the document was merely the world catching up to something that had already been decided on a frozen road 5 days into the worst week of his life. "Thank you, Sheriff." Hadley grunted. He adjusted the collar of his jacket and looked at Copper and Scout the way men of a certain age look at things that remind them why they chose the work they chose. "Town owes you, Hale. Not just for catching those men, for reminding folks that courage does not always come with speeches and sirens." He paused. His green eyes held steady. "Sometimes it comes in protecting something small." Beckett did not answer with words. The faint, quiet smile on his face was enough. He walked down Main Street with Copper and Scout bounding through the snow beside him, leaving a zigzag trail of paw prints that crossed and recrossed like a conversation between two brothers who had not yet run out of things to say. People stepped out of shops to wave. The baker with the rosy cheeks who had carried a lantern up the hill. The elderly postman whose shaking hands had held his light the steadiest. Claire, the tall, freckled woman who ran the hardware store, who had driven her truck through the storm to bring the deputies closer to the ridge. They remembered, small towns do. When he reached Gentry's Market, the door opened before he could touch it. Helen stood in the entrance wrapped in a deep maroon coat with a scarf wound around her neck, her silver hair falling in soft waves from beneath her beanie. Her face lined and wise and carrying the particular beauty that belongs to women who have survived things that would have hardened lesser souls, brightened the moment she saw the dogs. "There they are," she said warmly. "Our little heroes." Scout trotted to her first tail wagging. Copper followed, leaning into her hand as she scratched behind his ears. Helen held out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "For you." Beckett unfolded it. A hand-knitted scarf. Dense, soft, patterned in deep forest green and pale winter white. The yarn was heavy with warmth, heavy with meaning, heavy with the hours of work that a 68-year-old woman had put into it, while a blizzard raged and a man she barely knew was running for his life on a frozen hillside. "I started it the night you went missing in the storm," Helen said. Her voice caught, but she held it. "Figured if you made it back, you would need something warm." Beckett held the scarf in both hands. He looked at the stitching, tight, even precise, the work of someone who needed her hands to be busy while her heart was breaking. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but he meant them the way a man means words when there are no better ones available. And the simple ones will have to carry the weight of everything he cannot say. Helen touched his arm. Her grip was strong. "You gave this town hope again, Beckett. Do not forget to give some to yourself." Before he could respond, another figure hurried across the lot. Edith Calloway, sturdy despite her 70 years, her silver blonde hair tied in a loose bun, her cheeks pink from the walk, carrying a small wooden box in both hands. "I have something for the boys," she announced, slightly breathless. "And no, you do not get to argue." She opened the box. Inside lay 2 small brass name tags, each one engraved in careful letters. One read, Copper. The other read Scout. They were attached to leather collars, hand-stitched sized perfectly for 2 growing German Shepherd puppies. Beckett brushed a thumb over the engraved letters. "How much do I owe you?" "Not a cent," Edith said firmly. "Those puppies would not be alive without you." Her voice softened. She looked at him the way she had looked at him that first day in the clinic, with recognition, with understanding, with the quiet knowing of a woman who had spent 30 years loving a soldier and had learned that the bravest thing a broken man can do is allow himself to be found. "My husband saved every stray creature he met," she said, "and every single one of them saved him right back." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small, a photograph, old, slightly faded, with soft edges from years of being held. She placed it in Beckett's hand. It showed a man, perhaps 60, with kind eyes and a weathered face, sitting on a porch that looked remarkably similar to the one on Beckett's cabin. In his arms, cradled against his chest with infinite tenderness, was a puppy. A German Shepherd, black and tan, gazing up at the man with an expression of total, unshakable trust. The pose was identical. The same angle of the arms, the same tilt of the head, the same look in the dog's eyes. It was Beckett holding Scout. It was Edith's husband holding a puppy 30 years ago. It was the same image, separated by decades, but connected by something that time could not diminish. Beckett stared at the photograph for a long time. He did not speak. He did not need to. Edith rested her hand on his arm. Her hazel eyes were bright, not with tears, but with something warmer. Something that looked like completion. He would have been so glad, she whispered, to know the clinic led to this. Beckett nodded. And in the nod and in the silence that surrounded it, something passed between them that required no words. Gratitude, yes. Respect, certainly. But more than that. The recognition that healing is not a straight line. It is a circle. It moves through people and animals and strangers and storms, and it comes back eventually to the place where it began, carrying with it everyone it touched along the way. He knelt and fastened the collars around the puppies' necks. Copper immediately pranced in a circle, his new tag catching the sunlight. Scout held still, looking up at Beckett with those dark, steady eyes, as if he understood that the tag was more than decoration. It was a name given by someone who loved him, and a name for a creature that had once been nothing more than a number on a rotting board in an abandoned barn was everything. That afternoon, Beckett returned to the cabin on Pine Ridge. The snow sparkled beneath the winter sun, every crystal throwing light in a different direction until the ground looked like it had been scattered with diamonds. Smoke curled from the chimney, lazy and slow. The cabin, which had been nothing more than a hiding place a month ago, looked different now. Not because anything about its structure had changed, but because the man who lived inside it had. He stacked fresh firewood. He lit the stove. He filled the water bowls and set out the food and watched Copper and Scout chase each other across the rug with a joy so complete and so unself-conscious that it made the air in the room feel lighter. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in soft gold and lavender that bled into the deep blue of approaching night, Beckett stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under his weight. A familiar, steady sound. The sound of something that would hold. Copper trotted to his left side, circled once, and lay down against his boot. His breathing slowed. His eyes half closed. Content. Scout curled at his right, resting his chin on Beckett's shoe with a sigh so deep and so complete that it seemed to release every fear the small dog had ever carried. His body relaxed. His tail lay still. At peace. The forest stretched out before them, white and silent and enormous. The sky dimmed. The first star appeared faint and trembling above the tallest pine on the ridge. Beckett looked at the snow, at the soft glow from the cabin window behind him, at the two small souls beside him, breathing gently, trusting completely alive, because a man who did not believe he deserved anything good had decided to stop on a frozen road and pick up what the world had thrown away. Something inside him, something that had been locked tight since a building collapsed in a desert on the other side of the world, loosened. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to let the air in. Enough to let the warmth reach the places that had been cold for so long he had forgotten they were there. He was not the man he had been before the desert. He would never be that man again. But he was becoming someone else. Someone who had 2 dogs and a porch and a town that knew his name. Someone who had been chosen by 2 small creatures who did not care about his ghosts, only about his hands and his voice and the steady beat of his heart. Copper's tail brushed his leg. Scout's breath warmed his shoe. "Yeah," Beckett whispered, "we are home." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he meant every word. The quiet settled over them like a blessing. The kind of quiet that does not come from the absence of sound, but from the presence of peace. And far away across the snow, the last light faded from the ridge, and the forest stood still, and the stars appeared one by one, as if the sky itself were lighting lanterns for the night. In the end, the story of Beckett Copper and Scout is not really about a rescue. It is about being rescued. It is about the truth that miracles rarely arrive the way we expect them. They do not come with thunder or trumpets or blinding light. Sometimes they come on trembling legs wrapped in frost in the smallest creatures placed gently in our path by a hand we cannot see but have always felt. Sometimes grace finds us not when we are strong, but when we are broken. Not when we are searching, but when we have stopped. Not when we believe we deserve it, but precisely when we are certain we do not. Beckett Hale did not save those puppies. Those puppies saved him. And in that exchange, in that simple, quiet miracle on a frozen road in Idaho, something ancient and beautiful happened. Two hearts that had been discarded found a heart that had been closed. And together in the cold, in the storm, in the long walk home, they opened. If this story touched something in you today, if it reminded you that even in the harshest winter of your life, warmth is closer than you think, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. And if you would like to walk this road with us again, I hope you will subscribe so we can continue finding these stories together. May God bless you. May He protect your family. And may He place a small, trembling miracle on your doorstep, exactly when you need it most.